This afternoon we'll be talking about world energy investment, and we've heard a little bit about this from Ian's presentation just before. Of course there was a special report published by the IEA just a few months ago on exactly this topic, and this is available on the IEA website. Some of our speakers today may touch on this, and indeed the session will be chaired by Quentin Grafton. So Quentin is a professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy here at the ANU. He's a member of the Energy Change Institute, and indeed Quentin has had a distinguished career both in academia and outside. He was for a while the head of BRE, the Bureau of Resource and Energy Economics, and Quentin brings a particular perspective on public policy, being one of the 7 members of the ANU Energy Change Institute who are public policy fellows here at the ANU. So please welcome Quentin and his team.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ken, and it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I had a wonderful day when I was here in terms of being able to listen to some fantastic presentations, and I think we'll give them the applause at the end of the day. But to Ken and the team putting this together, it's been tremendous. Look, I was asked to talk for 5 minutes. I've got a very distinguished panel that's going to come shortly after me. They'll talk for about 10 minutes each, and then there's plenty of time for Q&A. And I certainly appreciate it with Steve Drew and also with Ian Cronshaw, the ability to actually get in there and ask some questions. So I hope you'll also engage in terms of the Q&A. So I don't really have a lot to say. There's a lot being said, a lot of facts and figures. I'm just going to go through some basics, which I think everyone probably is aware of, but it's worth emphasizing because sometimes people say certain things and it's surprising that they will actually say that when you look and look at the facts in detail. And I'll mention nobody by name. So the first thing I want to start off with is, as Ken mentioned, I am an economist, and I certainly understand that markets can and do work, and that there are incentives that are necessary to bring about the sorts of behaviors that we want. So yes, we want to have markets, and we want to have markets working. So the issue that we've been talking about essentially today is the issue of market intervention in some form or other. So Ian talked about it in the context of the new policy scenario vis-a-vis the 450 scenario, vis-a-vis the current policy scenario. That's all about market intervention in some form or other, changing what will happen in the sense of doing something differently. We heard about it this morning as well in the context of where we're heading in terms of trajectories, in terms of CO2 emissions, and of course in terms of parts per million by volume, in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as was told to us, we've got sort of 3 options. There's considerable variability in terms of it's either going to be bad, it's going to be very bad, or it's going to be catastrophic. So those are the words from this morning. So that tells us something, that the current state of affairs, the current market system, is not delivering for us, because if it would deliver for us, we presumably wouldn't be delivering something in the years to come that at best case is bad, and at worst case is catastrophic. That doesn't make any sense. Why would we do that? So that clearly means we need to intervene in a variety of ways. And so one of the things that, as Ken pointed out, and as Ian also mentioned, there's a massive amount of investment happening between now, 2014, and 2040. And there's a report that came out by the IEA a few months ago, looked at that issue of energy investment. It didn't go out to 2040, it went out to 2035. And those numbers are mind-boggling. So, I mean, obviously it's over a period of time, it's not on an annual basis, but they're talking in their new policy scenario. I mean, Ian talked about it just before the afternoon tea, the new policy scenario. We're talking about $48 trillion of investment in terms of the energy sector, with about $8 trillion of that being in terms of energy efficiency. And the interesting thing in terms of that IEA, not the World Energy Outlook, but that publication that came out a few months ago, the interesting thing is they make a comparison between the new policy scenario and the 450 parts per million by volume scenario. And in terms of the investment isn't substantially different. It's 48 trillion in the new policy scenario. It's 53 trillion in the 450 parts per million by volume. So that tells us something. If you do the math, 5 trillion over that period of time, and look at, you know, bad, very bad, or catastrophic, we can do some rough, ready numbers in terms of whether that makes sense or not. And there's been a huge amount of work done on climate change mitigation, the costs and benefits of it. So that really takes us to the issue of well, what do we do about it? And the answer actually was given to us this morning. And it's not rocket science. You don't have to be a Nobel Prize winning scientist to work it out, although he certainly told us about it today. So there's 2 sets of issues here, okay? So overlaying it in the first issue is the demand. So if you think about demand, energy demand changing over the next few decades, if you're in a situation where you are having growth in your energy demand, that's a bad thing in the sense that that has to be met in some form or other, and certainly if it's met through fossil fuels, you've got climate change issues. But on the other hand, growth in the energy demand sector and energy demand gives you the opportunity to transform your sector perhaps at a faster rate than if your energy demand is a constant. So this is the issue of replacement vis-a-vis growth in terms of energy supply. So if you want to make a difference in terms of where you're going in terms of CO2 emissions, in terms of the energy sector, and I'm focusing now on the stationary energy sector, then it really has to be about replacement, okay? And in particular, early replacement. So in other words, there are plants that are generating high levels of CO2 emissions. You may wish to advance the replacement of those plants, because although we can look at differences in levelized costs of electricity, and typically that's how it's done, the comparisons are made with new builds, and that's what we heard this morning about new builds, okay? But that's not the comparison that's relevant to us when we talk about what's happening in the next few decades. The relevant comparison is the new builds, renewables and non-renewables, and the existing capacity. And that's the issue for us here. So the issue is are we able to bring about replacement at a faster rate? And there was a scheme that was in place in the previous government, which was unsuccessful in bringing about that sort of change, but it may be something that we want to revisit. That's the first issue. That's the issue of early replacement. Okay. The second issue is financing. Okay. So as I pointed out, I have the economic credentials. I'm an economist. The question is why would you want to intervene into the financial sector in terms of financing an alternative to, let's say, fossil fuel energy generation? Well, we heard again about that this morning. There are market failures in terms of the financing of these investments. And certainly when you think about the fact that not only is there a financing issue and in terms of making those determinations in terms of what gets built, there's also another set of issues is that the markets in which that electricity is sold is typically not a competitive market. Okay? It is regulated in some shape, form or other. So you've got market intervention on the one side on the downstream, and on the other side you've got the financing issues about where we can make markets work for us rather than against us. So those are I think those are 2 key issues when we think about investment. One is the issue of early replacement. Why? Because there's a market failure in the context of GHG emissions. The other one is financing. There's also a market failure there. The idea to help markets work with us, not to replace them, but to work with us in the context of addressing those costs. Why? Well, you do the sums in terms of the costs and the benefits. It makes sense to be doing something now rather than later. And indeed, I haven't said this to Ian, but it's always struck me as rather ironic that the World Energy Outlook keeps on focusing on the 450. And I'm just thinking, at what point will they no longer have the 450 scenario? Probably, certainly for the next 5 years, it may no longer be a viable scenario. It will be a meaningless scenario. And the IEA might have the 500 scenario because we will most certainly have passed the 450 part. So that's enough for me. Some fascinating material that I've heard today. I've really enjoyed it. We have 3 great speakers coming up very shortly with different perspectives. We have 2 from Australia and 1 from Germany. I'm very pleased for our guest from overseas to come here. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Paul Smith from the Australian Energy Market Commission to come up and give us a presentation.
Thank you, Quentin, and thank you also to Ken very much for the opportunity to speak here. I came a couple of years ago, so it's good to be back. For those of you who don't know, the Australian Energy Market Commission is one of three institutions we have in Australia that are responsible in various ways for the sort of regulation policy framework of the national electricity market and some aspects of the gas market. The role of the AEMC is essentially twofold. One, we are the rule maker, so people can propose changes to the rules that govern how the national electricity and some of the gas markets operate. We also provide policy advice to the Council of Australian Government's Energy Council, which is made up of the state and territory energy ministers and chaired by Minister McFarlane as the Commonwealth Minister. So there's two roles for us there. I want to focus, I guess, my sort of brief remarks on energy market trends we've been experiencing here in Australia, including investment and disinvestment decisions that are being made, and perhaps what that means for government and regulators and policymakers more generally, and to reflect somewhat on perhaps the similarities and also the contrast between that and the global energy market trends, including those that Ian talked about from the World Energy Outlook, and perhaps also how the responses by governments here in Australia are compared to those overseas. So I think in a number of respects we're facing similar pressures to many other first world economies identified in the investment outlook. So we've got new and disruptive technologies changing the relationship between consumers and the market. The expansion of the global LNG trade is about to hit us in the next sort of year, 18 months, with the developments in Queensland, exposing our local market to international prices and, of course, falling generally in most of the states and territories' electricity demand. In terms of the national electricity market, falling demand and the capacity installed under the renewable energy target principally and some state feed-in tariffs for solar PV has led to a large capacity overhang, and that's being seen in the wholesale prices that we can observe in the market on a day-to-day basis. Thermal generators have seen returns fall. Some have expressed concerns in various ways about what that means for future reliability of supply, but also whether there is a need, and Quentin alluded to the policy of the previous government, but whether there is a need for some sort of government intervention to facilitate exit or disinvestment of some description from the generation market to get a better supply-demand balance going forward. From the AEMC's perspective, we believe actually we're at a degree of a crossroads here in terms of how we handle this issue, and the future of the market itself will depend heavily on the path that we take. So one path would involve government intervention to address the excess capacity, where the government and ultimately taxpayers in some form or other would be required to pay generators for closing down their units. And I guess the rationale, and Quentin I think alluded to this a little, is that there is some element of a perceived barrier to exit or some sort of market failure which would prevent some sort of orderly or appropriate exit of generation units and the consequences that might flow from that. But I think it is important to remember that the market was originally created to generate appropriate price signals, both in terms of when investment is required, and we have seen some investment built over the period since '98 when the market was introduced, but also when generation is no longer required. So when prices rise, more is built, and when prices fall, as they are now, that's a sign for units to exit. And indeed, we did see a couple of weeks ago, Energy Australia announced the exit of some units in some brown coal, so black coal units in New South Wales at Wallerawang, which was I think about 1,000 megawatts. These are commercial decisions. The risks associated with these are best borne, in our view, by those who are best able to manage the risks, i.e. generators and their investors, and not taxpayers or energy consumers directly. And I think there are some cautionary tales that at least we take from perhaps what's going on overseas and what we draw from some of the outcomes overseas, and that is that if government is, to put it bluntly, at both ends of the investment decision, so they are both through things like the renewable energy target, incentivising new investment, and at the other end of the decision, effectively the driver of what is disinvested. I'm not sure we actually have a market anymore, and we might want to think carefully about whether that's where we want to get to. And a number of countries around the world, I guess either responding to that or contemplating that sort of scenario, are starting to develop capacity mechanisms. I have to say I hesitate to call them markets because I'm not sure they truly are markets in themselves, but some sort of mechanism to do that. Ian, I think, mentioned the UK, which will run its first capacity auction in December this year for the delivery of capacity in 2018-19. And what we've seen there, at least again our reading, and I'm happy to be contested if people want to contest it, but is that we now have a position in the UK where they have a capacity shortage, but many generators, effectively most generators now, will only make decisions about whether to invest in new plant if there is some sort of government-provided certainty about returns. I don't have the actual number in front of me, but EDF's new nuclear plant has some very high double digits sort of price attached to it over some double-digit period of time, which I guess the UK, I'm not sure whether it's the consumers or the taxpayers are effectively underwriting or guaranteeing. And that's a theme, and I don't know whether the World Energy Investment Outlook looks at it from our perspective in a sense, but says, decisions to commit capital to the energy sector are increasingly shaped by government policy measures and incentives rather than by signals coming from competitive markets. So far, Australia, I think, has broadly, I'll come to the renewable energy target in a minute, booked that trend. And we've had a market that has gone down a different consumer-driven, retailer participant-driven path. A little while ago, the AEMC published what we called a little bit of a short history of the market and a case study in what we called successful microeconomic reform, which looked at how the markets came about, particularly during the 1990s. And I think it's always worth reflecting on where we were and why we got to where we were before we move on again, which is the problem then was that the governments controlled everything. And it was perceived that the decisions that governments made in terms of what they invested in terms of what was built, was either the wrong decision, too costly, inefficient. So we need to be very cautionary, I think, before we go back to that place again. And we have had, in our view at least, a very successful energy-only market over a number of years, a market that does send, when it's allowed to, clear price signals that reflect the supply-demand balance. Now, of course, there is some issues that perhaps are making life challenging for generators, notwithstanding falling demand, which I think broadly argue is a sort of shareholder risk to bear, and that is around the policy uncertainty in relation to environmental policies in Australia. The Commission doesn't have a role in what should be our climate change targets per se, but I guess the point we'd make is there is a bipartisan agreement on a path to 2020. The electricity sector clearly plays a significant role in the emissions, so some credible policy framework is needed for electricity to play its part in that. But I guess the point we'd make is that we don't think successful energy policy and successful carbon or environmental policy need to be seen as two mutually exclusive objectives that never come together. And we've pushed for some period of time, I can't say necessarily with great success, but to see greater integration between the two spheres of policy. And again, I think the World Investment Outlook to some degree draws on this or makes a similar point in the sense that policymakers are subject to various and often conflicting pressures, and how to draw those together, how to get those to work effectively is an important challenge for policymakers. We think the renewable energy target in Australia is an example of a policy that hasn't worked all that effectively with the national electricity market. It's had a fixed gigawatt hour target, 41,000 gigawatt hours, which was designed at a point in time when demand forecasts were for demand to continue to rise. We now have flat or falling demand, and we're still trying to force renewable capacity into the market, notwithstanding the degree of oversupply that's already there. And generation, because of that structure of the RET, built under that, doesn't bear the same demand risk that other generators in the market bear in terms of they've got the fixed target, the other generators do not. But I guess more fundamentally, the point we're trying to make on environmental and climate change policy is how can we work better together between the energy sector and those objectives to get policies that deliver the environmental objectives in a way that works with the market. We don't think it has to be a choice between the two, but how do we get those two things to come better together so that both objectives can be satisfied in a way that is efficient, cost-effective for consumers ultimately. And I think we've seen, sadly in Australia, a range of policies at different levels of government that have not delivered emissions at a particularly cost-effective nor sustainable way. And if we want an effective, efficient investment environment, we need policies that people believe are going to last for periods of time, not policies that are delivering unsustainable quantities of transfers from one group to another, because sooner or later, politically, they won't last. So I've spoken, I guess, at the generation level. I did just want to finish my remarks. I think I've probably got about a minute or so with one other important trend, which I think should play to this debate, and that is really about the role of consumers and how they are becoming increasingly proactive, sophisticated in the way that they engage with energy markets. So the uptake of new technologies, the willingness to adopt measures such as solar power to sell capacity back into the grid, the greater use of technology, appliances that we can now can be used to sort of control demand. We even saw that somebody's selling a cooker that you can sort of use a sort of timer on your cooker. I'm not sure why entirely you'd want to do that, to be perfectly honest. But anyway, there are all these increasingly sophisticated devices that allow consumers to participate in this way. And our work is very much focused on supporting that change and recognizing that consumers will, in a sense almost whether we want them to or not, become more active in the market and drive those sorts of choices. So how do we provide incentives, price structures that allow consumers to participate effectively in the market? And we did some case studies recently. So as an example, a residential consumer using a 5 kilowatt air conditioner in peak times, by our estimate, caused about $1,000 of additional network costs compared with a similar energy user without an air conditioner. But the residential consumer with the air conditioner only pays about $300 under the common structure of network prices. So the remaining $700 is recovered from everybody else, big and small consumers. We've made some changes that are pushing networks in the direction of addressing those types of issues. But that's just an example, I think, of there are a lot of things that we can do to get the incentives right in terms of the behaviour that consumers engage in, that will make a difference to both the total quantity of electricity used, but also when that electricity is used. And that's not about more intervention in the market from government per se, but it's about getting the structures, the incentives, the prices right for consumers. Okay, I've probably exhausted my time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. There's a set of issues there in 10 minutes, and I'm sure it'll come out in the Q&A, particularly about the RAD and who's paying for it, et cetera, et cetera. But our next speaker is Tim Nelson, so from the private sector, one of Australia's oldest companies, in fact, will give us a 10-minute presentation. Over to you, Tim.
All right. Yeah, thank you again to Ken and the team for hosting. Thank you. It's interesting, as I was sitting in the audience this morning, you might remember that the question was asked, there must be no one here from the power industry, and I sheepishly sat down and thought, oh no, I am here. You know, when you work for a utility and you hear things like, you know, it moves at a glacial pace, and then I'm an economist as well, and all I could think of was that I'm very, very slowly assume away the real world. So I thought I'd just touch on a few of the key issues that I see for how Australia might think about new investment in power generation. So I'm going to put to one side transmission and distribution and just talk about power generation. And I'll talk about it in two ways. The first is renewables, and the second is how we might think of other types of generation coming into the market. So the first graph here, everyone's seen a variation of this before. Demand's declining. We all know that. But we also know that peak demand over the last 15 years has grown in excess of underlying energy demand. So lots of capacity has been added to the system to meet that. Now, the really interesting thing, though, and this is where I think Paul's touched on a really important point here, is that if you go back, and this is a terrible colour, but there are some big bars, there are some big bars there on the left from 97 through to 2003. So all of the original capacity that was added into the NEM after it was first created was all being driven by those market signals that Paul was talking about. Prices would go up and the market would respond by building more capacity. Now, each of those bars that you can see that's shaded slightly differently shows that all of the capacity really from 2004 onwards has been driven by some type of government policy. Now, the reason that's so important is that when we talk about how the market has responded, it's also worth thinking about the fact that it's not just renewables that have been driven by types of policies that governments have introduced. We've had the Queensland 13%, then 18% gas scheme, and you've had the New South Wales greenhouse gas abatement scheme. So you've had a whole bunch of policies that have been very successful at adding more low emission capacity. And that's something that's really important, because when we talk about the current oversupply in the market, it's really worth noting that a lot of the new capacity has been driven at least partially, and I say at least partially, by those types of policies. So where have we ended up? Well, we've ended up in a market that's very heavily oversupplied, or there's a lot more capacity than you'd require if you were building it from scratch today. Now, don't get too concerned by the table here. The key numbers there are that you've got around, but depending upon people's estimates, somewhere between 6 and 10 gigawatts of oversupply in the market. Now, what does that equate to? It's 3 or 4 very large coal-fired power stations. Now, the interesting thing is that, and this is just a coincidence, but if you correct that market imbalance just by removing all of the subsidy-driven plant, and that's not just renewables, that's gas-fired plant as well, you come out about even. So when people talk about declining demand having had an impact, it certainly has, but you're also in this situation where government policy has played a role as well. And I think Paul's point is a really, really good one. What do we want as a society? Do we want low emission energy? Yes, if there is a government policy that's incentivising that in, you can't just ignore the consequences on the underlying wholesale market. And this is, I think, where the rubber hits the road. So again, the colours are terrible. I apologise for this. I'll go back and tell the Azure brand people we've got to change colours. You can see the line is showing capacity utilisation. So it's the capacity in the market and it's the proportion of time that it's effectively being utilised. And it's contrasting it with all of the new subsidy-driven plant that's come into the market. And it's just no coincidence. If you've got stagnant or falling demand and you've got lots more capacity being added to the market, one of two things is going to happen. If existing capacity is not retired, then you're going to have a reduction in your capacity utilisation. Otherwise, you've got to have that capacity coming out of the market to maintain capacity utilisation. Again, not rocket science, but something that's very worth noting, because it's having a pretty big impact. So the question really in my mind is that if we want more renewables, then we really need to see a sustainable wholesale market and a sustainable market for the large generation certificates. So as I stand here today, pricing for large-scale generation certificates is about $30 a certificate. Depending upon the wholesale market you're in, you might get $30 or $40. That gets you to a combined revenue stream of about $70. And we know that particularly with the depreciation in the Australian dollar, that the commissioning cost, the LRMC, long run marginal cost of a new wind farm, for instance, is well north of that. So we're in a situation where two things are going on. You've got a very depressed wholesale price because of this oversupply, and then you've also got this manifest policy uncertainty. So that the renewable energy target, it's been reviewed 5 times and materially changed 3 times since its inception, and that's a period of about 12 or 13 years. So you can see that investors, not just utilities, but the people providing the finance, whether they be banks or the providers of equity, are obviously very nervous about the fact that you don't have, again, to be an energy economist to know that if plants have been commissioned more at $90 or $100 a megawatt hour and they're only earning at the current spot price about $60 or $70, then it's not the world's greatest investment case for new investment, let alone the existing investment. So I think the critical question that policymakers and we as civil society need to ask is that if you're bringing all this plant in through mechanisms such as gas schemes or renewable energy targets, do you actually need to do anything to retire old plant? And what we've said is that we actually think that there are these potential, and I say potential barriers to exit, because this is something which is really playing out all over the world and no one really knows, I think, what is actually going to manifest in practice. So the 4 that we've identified are policy uncertainty. In the current environment, why would you do anything when you've got some significant disagreement on what the policy should be in 2020 for the renewable energy target? You've got all of this discussion around what is the policy around emission reductions beyond 2020. Why would you do anything? Why wouldn't you wait and hope to see that policy uncertainty is resolved? The second one is asset sweating. The gap between that short-run marginal cost of operating an existing power station and the long-run marginal cost of building something new is huge. It's very, very big. The cost of running an incumbent power station is very, very low. The other thing is we know that 72% of the existing steam fleet, so that's mainly coal and gas, has passed its original design life. So you're into what I think was referred to earlier in the day as you're in these band-aid solution type CapEx programs where to the extent that I can keep it running, great, because I don't incur any of those fixed costs of a new power station. First mover disadvantage, why would you do anything when it affects your competitors in a positive way? It's that classic economic problem. And then the last one is obvious, which is the remediation cost. So how is it that these sites will be remediated? So this is a bit of, again, being an economist, you've got to put up a partial equilibrium diagram. All it's really showing is that as you add more supply, particularly very low short-run marginal cost supply, and that's what renewables are, larger fixed costs, but virtually no short-run marginal cost because the fuel is free. You push the supply curve out to the right, assuming, again, and this is an assumption, that no plant leaves the market. As demand declines, you see that reduction in wholesale pricing. So the very price which you need to actually see rise over time to incentivise new investment is actually falling. And that's what we're seeing play out in real time. So the question that I think is really relevant for today is complementary policy required? And I think it's really important to highlight that whenever you're talking about policy, in this case, there are 3 options for intervention, and there's one other option, which I think Paul hinted at, is let the market rip and just wait to see these power stations exit the market. But if you were going to intervene, we've thought of 3 main mechanisms. A market-based mechanism, a requirement that for every megawatt that comes in, a megawatt comes out. Regulation, just regulate power stations out of existence. And the final one is the one that we've seen tried but not implemented here, which was contracts for closure. I think I'm going pretty close to time, but I've got to get a plug in for this book. Being at least a semi-academic, we had a chapter in this recent book, so I'll leave you with that to think about. It's the best $141 you'll ever spend. Talks about partial grid substitution of solar PV. Thank you.
There's no problem having. It's a good thing. Look, our third and last speaker is Hans Josef-Fell. It's come all the way from Germany. So over to you, please.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for introduction me. Thank you for invitation here in Canberra. Oh, thank you. It is not my first time here in Australia. I'm the 4th time here. I was in previous years together with the parliamentarians to discuss over the feed-in-tariff laws, renewable legislations, research programs and others. And so I'm very familiar here in Australia with your politics. And I'm very astonished over the switch with your new Premier Abbott. But I have to accept it. It is your decision here in Australia. But I can find it is not a good idea when we want to protect the climate. And Australia is very, very hard under pressure with climate issues. So let's speak about the energy investment and especially over renewable investment. You see the last year's investment into renewables, it increased till 2011 very hard, then it decreased. It is only caused by decreasing of solar investment in new factories, but in this years we have already an increasing. But it is on a low level, we heard it already from the previous speakers, compared with energy investment by the whole. It is more than 10 times higher the whole yearly energy investment in the world. When we want to achieve a climate protection, we must come to a 100% renewable saved world, because this means nearly no emissions from energy sector, and we know 80% of the emissions comes from the use of coal, of natural gas and oil. And when we do not cut these emissions, we will see an increasing of temperature of the world. This is not a good idea when we look to the disasters at 0.8 degrees global warming at the moment. 2 degrees global warming, I believe, is unacceptable for the humankind and not to achieve. And therefore, we must go to the target to completely switch the investment to 100% renewables. It is possible, faster than we believe. You know, the Stanford University in California, they made a plan for the world together with David University nearby, a plan for the world to come within 20 years to 100% renewables. Stanford says clearly, why should we not achieve it? We had students in the 80s who worked on new information technologies, and IBM told them, and never will come a personal computer to the world. They would be very crazy, the students, but we know the biggest industry cluster in the world created then after the students worked on with personal computers, mobile phone and others. And now in 20 years we had the revolution. And Stanford says the same revolution is possible. Within 20 years there is no obstacles with industry levels, no obstacles with financial levels, only with political and manager ideas who want to protect the old business. It is cheaper to go to 100% renewables within 20 years. It costs about 100,000 billion US dollar. It seems to be too high. But to go on with the conventional energy, it is about 200,000 billion US dollar. So I ask you, what would be cheaper? It is clear in these figures. But we have a lot of obstacles to switch the world private money flow into renewable energy sector. One is wrong evaluations in fossil and nuclear, overestimated to their possibilities, also wrong political frameworks worldwide, and a political fight, completely fight renewables from fossil and nuclear business sector. It is often by corruption, lobbyism, worldwide the same figure. I can tell a lot of these examples in Germany too. Look to the evaluation. We heard today a lot over the World Energy Outlook. In 2040, we await 100 million barrels per day. We should compare it with the World Energy Outlook forecast from 2003. They awaited. From World Energy Outlook to the next one, it is in reduced figures what we have to await. We believe from the Energy Watch Group, a very small scientific report about that we cannot achieve 100 million barrels per day, perhaps a half, 50 million barrels. But when you say, oh no, IEA says otherwise, they have a lot of experts. So we should not believe it is a Bible. Look to the forecasts from the past. We had in 2004 a forecast for the oil price from International Energy Agency for today with $22 per barrel, but you know it is much higher. The people discuss today, oh, we have a cheap oil price. No, it is nearly 4 times higher than predicted in 2004 from the International Energy Agency. And the forecasts in renewables were overseeded. Wind power in 2010 was 2 times more invested, and in photovoltaics 5 times more. I believe there will only one constant issue with the predictions and the forecasts of IEA. They underestimate the possibilities for renewable energies, and they overestimate the possibilities for fossil and nuclear sector. We will see the world will come to another world, and the changes are already seen in a lot of issues. Look to the natural gas exporter nation of USA. No, they don't export gas. They are netto importer. And they will not become an exporter because the shale gas hype is already over. When you look to Texas in the details, you can see there is already a declining into investment and others, and we see the peak of shale gas soon in the next years. And with the dry gas declining that goes on since years, it will be a reduced of gas production in the USA. And the reality today, renewable investment is now cheaper than fossil nuclear, completely otherwise than 10 years ago. Fossil and nuclear becomes more and more stranded investment. You see it on some places in the world already today. And private fossil and nuclear investment comes only with highly public subsidies. And the public subsidization leads to public borrowing. You know what public borrowing means. We can tell you a lot over the public borrowed southern European nations. It leads to the European financial crisis. And it is mostly influenced by energy imports that we cannot pay. This is a wonderful result from the IEA studies. Not renewable energies are highly subsidized. Fossil is highly subsidized. And only because of this subsidizing, fossil energies are cheap for the energy consumers. But the energy consumers pay it by their tax. It is not a good idea to switch it. We would need the true cost for the fossil and nuclear sector. Then we would see everywhere in the world renewable energies would be completely, immediately competitive. But instead of the fact that we do not include the external cost, mostly worldwide, and that we do not reduce the subsidizing to save the national budget, instead of this fact, we see already stranded investment. Look to Germany. Some monopolists like E.ON decided 10 years ago to invest in new coal power and natural gas power stations. They have no chance to refinance it. Now they are ready. They want to come to the grid. The grid is full with renewable energies, 1/3 of the electricity production, and they have no chance to refinance it. Stranded assets today, and therefore E.ON 1 week ago made a new decision. You know, E.ON is the biggest utility in Europe in electricity sector. They decided now to swap out coal and nuclear business, natural gas and oil as well, and they concentrate to new business, renewables distribution, and nothing else. That's a very new signal when a company does it. A company that was hardly fighting against the politicians like me to create renewable support, but now they can see they have no other chance. And we see same figures in China. In Beijing region has decided to ban the coal use completely by 2020. I believe we could see from Professor Chu this morning, Harbin city and others, they will follow very soon. They have no chance. When they want to have clean air, they must ban the coal use. And China will do it. I clearly know this. I often speak with Chinese politicians. Nuclear power plants in Europe, I will show it exactly in the next slide, is only a financial flop. The same is new drilling for deep sea oil in Brazil. We will not see the oil what IEA forecast from deep sea oil. There is no return of investment and the investors goes out. Nuclear renaissance, we have today less nuclear power in operation than 1 decade ago, and this declining goes on. With a new operation, we have 2 ones in Europe. They are only incredible financial disasters, too late, 10 years late with electricity productions and plant, and more than 2 or 3 times over budgeted than planning costs. The operator, construction operator Areva in France, a fortnight ago must say, we made a deficit of 4 billion euro within 3 years. Areva stands completely before bankrupt because of new nuclear power operation. That's the truth over nuclear power and the renaissance. There is no chance. It is not profitable anymore. But when you look how the comparison with new investment into energy sectors, this is from Lessard from USA this spring, the analysis. Wind and solar is now the cheapest energy sources in the world. Even biomass and geothermal is competitive in some places with gas, coal, and nuclear. So renewables now are the game changer, because the investors look for return of investment, and they will see more and more in the coming years that the return of investment will in conventional energy sector not come. And we could support and accelerate it with good climate and energy security policies. Energy security is as well necessary to look to the details. We in Europe see now that the fight over resources leads to a war. The Ukraine war is in the deeper reason a gas war. It is not a good idea to go on with more scarcity resources to fight and make wars about it. Financing is not the only thing. What would be the best political strategies? Make feed-in-tariff laws, tax reliefs for renewables, a carbon tax, what you decided very good in Australia and cancelled it. Carbon tax is the right instrument, not emission trading because of the volatility. It does not work anywhere in the world. Cancel the subsidizing for fossil and nuclear industry. It is very necessary to save the national budgets. And strengthen the research and education in the sector. ANU makes a very good role in the sector. Thank you for this. The financing into a strategy that goes to 100% renewables is very clear. Yes, financing must flow to the existing technologies. Solar, wind, biothermal, bioenergy, geothermal, hydro. But also in new technologies, electric cars, supergrids, decentralized. I will show you at the end immediately one short examples. And we must look more to new technologies. There are a lot of new technologies in the pipelines who are not yet in the market, but they have a big potential for climate protection and energy sector. Biocoal, greening the deserts, the shadowing with photovoltaics, water desalination with solar or wind. Food and energy growth in desert is possible when we go the right ways with biocoal as a fertilizer. This is an example for a study from ANU, from Andrew Blaker. It is cheaper to bring the electricity to Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, and other regions with a supergrid from Gobi to Australia than to go on with coal or natural gas. Make it. This is a design with distribution plus generation of energy. And last week, this study was shown in Kyoto at the solar conference. The Gobi Northeast Asian supergrid will produce with 0.0 euro per kilowatt hour. This is less than 6 US dollar cent per kilowatt hour. It is completely financed, the supergrid, distribution, and production. You have no cheaper option in this region with energy production. Go to this. Or go to decentralized new technologies. I'm ready, yes. Hydrothermal carbonisation. Nearly no one knows it. Take your organic waste from municipals, from animals, from people, from agriculture waste. Make a new fuel from it. Biocoal. use this fuel as a substitute in coal power stations, use it as a substitute in chemical-based products, and as a fertilizer, and then you can bind the carbon from the atmosphere into the soil, and you can clean the atmosphere from too much carbon. It is possible. This is an example with greening the desert in Egypt desert. It is with vegetable oil from Reatrofa. Now the farmers have an oil for their diesel generators because mineral oils they cannot pay, but their own ground up oil they can pay. And between the oil plants is a crop, and before this time they had no crop. And when we save the water, we could shadow the area under the photovoltaic roofs. We can have 2 yields, solar electricity and corn. Food and energy is very important to bring it together. These are the tasks where the financiers should go to, and we have a chance to do it. When you are interested, I have also written a book. You can read more about the strategy, how to go to global cooling. It is possible in some decades when we work together on political, national, local level, as well as the finance industry and all together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Could I ask the speakers to come up to the front here for a panel? We'll have a Q&A. Thank you so much for that. Very interesting information. Just a couple of things I'm going to add to that is that there's been a lot of talk about technology today, rightly so. And it's nice that, Hans Josef, that you were talking about the other sets of issues, because it's not just the technology issue, it's about decision making as well. And both need to be put together to actually generate the good outcomes for us. So technology and good decision making together. And certainly as Tim and Paul stressed, the importance of government intervention, not only in Australia, but of course globally, makes it even more important that we have good decision making and do it at the appropriate time.